An individual who attempts to assassinate a sitting US president and is later found not guilty by reason of insanity probably has a long history of mental illness. We probably can see that they have mental illness and emotional issues in their childhood, throughout their lifespan, especially maybe in their teenage years, and we can kind of pinpoint that this individual probably has something wrong with them, right? Not so fast. We're going to talk today about John Hinkley Jr., an individual who had a relatively normal upbringing, had a normal childhood, yet changed the course of the legal system in the United States when it comes to the insanity defense. So let's look at Hinkley's younger life. Hinkley was born in 1955 and moved around a little bit in his childhood. He started in Oklahoma and moved to Dallas, Texas, and later moved to Colorado. His father was in the energy business and later started his own company. And he had two older siblings who also were relatively successful. One of his older brothers actually became the vice president of the family company. John, for his early life, led a relatively normal life. He graduated high school in 1973. He participated in sports throughout his childhood. He played football and basketball, hockey, soccer. He was actually elected the student body president twice while he was in school. But after school, things started to turn downhill for him. He enrolled in college and was off and on attending, wasn't really doing really well. Eventually decided to move to California to pursue a dream of being a songwriter, which turned out not to be so good. He wrote back home to his mom and dad asking for money and told them about this wonderful girlfriend, Lynn Collins, who he was in love with, which later we found out was a fabricated person. Lynn never really existed. Eventually, John was unable to live on his own out in California, so he moved back with the family. And during the late 70s and 80s, he started to amass a relatively small collection of firearms, and he began practicing with them. Nothing overtly aggressive, but he started to have an obsession with certain weapons. He was also prescribed some tranquilizers and some antidepressants because he was dealing with some emotional issues, specifically because he was not doing as well as he thought he should. It was also in this time that John developed a rather unhealthy obsession with a very young actress by the name of Jodie Foster. Now, at the time, Jodie had starred in a movie called Taxi Driver with Robert De Niro. The De Niro character actually was trying to get the character that Jodie Foster portrayed to become interested in him. He thought of different ways to get her attention after writing to her didn't work. He thought about hijacking an airplane and crashing it where she was living. He would send poems to her. He would send letters to her incessantly. He would slip them under Foster's door and he would call her incessantly. This was in a time before cell phones and definitely before caller ID. Foster really didn't know who the person was. It was around the early 80s when Hinkley decided that he was going to gain Foster's attention by actually attempting to assassinate a president. Now, he started by considering to assassinate Jimmy Carter, who was the president in the late 1970s. He actually followed Carter around, but was unsuccessful in any type of formulation of an attempt. However, in the early 80s, when Ronald Reagan was elected the president, Hinkley turned his obsession toward Reagan. He actually wrote a letter to Jodie Foster in a time right before he actually attempted to assassinate Reagan, and it read, "Over the past 7 months, I've left you dozens of poems, letters, and love messages in the faint hope that you could develop an interest in me. I have never had the nerve to simply approach you and introduce myself. The reason I'm going ahead with this attempt now is because I cannot wait any longer to impress you. Signed, John Hinkley Jr." This letter indicates the level to which John did not have a grip on reality. His thought was that he could impress Jodie Foster by assassinating a sitting president, but also inside this letter there's an implication that if he successfully assassinated the president, and let's go down the line of he actually did impress Jodie Foster, what would be the next logical step? Is Foster going to be able to reciprocate that love and that affection and that desire to be together? Well, no. If Foster knew that he killed the president, then other people would know he killed the president, and where would Hinkley be? He would be deep, deep in a prison cell until he probably would have been put to death for high treason. So his notion that he could do this and then ride off into the sunset with his lady love doesn't really hold water, and it really does speak to the fact that he was mentally ill during this time. So on March 30th, 1981, around 2:30 in the afternoon, Hinkley used a .22 caliber gun and shot at the president 6 times. It was right outside the Hilton Hotel in Washington, D.C. Hinkley wounded a police officer and a Secret Service agent, but also critically wounded Press Secretary James Brady. Hinkley didn't hit Reagan directly, although he was wounded by some of the shots. Interestingly enough, Hinkley did not flee and was arrested at the scene. Everybody survived, Brady, unfortunately, was hit on the side of the head and suffered a long list of medical issues, including a paralysis on the left side of his body. When Hinkley was put on trial in 1982, which occurred in Washington, D.C., he was charged with 13 different offenses, but he was found not guilty by reason of insanity. Now, we have to remember that there's two different levels here in the judicial system. There's guilty and not guilty. Guilty means that we're 90 to 95% sure that you did it. Not guilty does not mean that we are finding you to be innocent, but rather we are not going to hold you accountable for the actions we're accusing you of because we either don't have the evidence, or in this case, we don't feel, because of some mental defect, that you should be responsible for your actions. And so he was found not guilty by reason of insanity on June 21st, 1982. The defense psychiatric team reported him as insane, while the prosecution psychiatric team reported him as very lucid. One of the major key points of this was that Hinkley was writing these letters that indicated that he wasn't in his right mind, and also that he did not try to flee when he had committed the crime. Most people, the defense psychiatric team argued, if they did something, they would know that it's wrong. Most individuals who commit a crime try to flee directly afterwards because they know it's wrong and they know they're going to get caught. Hinkley, on the other hand, didn't flee. This was a strong indication that he was suffering from some mental illness, and under the Durham rule, if not for the fact that he was mentally ill, Hinkley would not have committed the crime that he was accused of, and therefore the insanity defense worked for him. This led to some major changes, and by 1984, public outcry had led to the Insanity Defense Reform Act, which altered the rules that considered mental illness in a federal criminal proceeding. Didn't change state, but changed federal. So, being that he was found not guilty, he could not be incarcerated because he's not guilty. When you're found not guilty, you're not incarcerated. However, a component of the insanity plea is that you will be remanded to the custody of the state in this case being the federal government. So Hinkley was confined at St. Elizabeth's Hospital in Washington, D.C. After Hinkley was admitted, tests found that he was unpredictably dangerous, which fits into the notion that he was mentally ill and therefore could not be held accountable for his actions. A lot of interest stayed with Hinkley. In 1983, Penthouse published an article that said a normal day would be that he would see a therapist, answer mail, play guitar, listen to music, play pool, watch TV, eat lousy food, and take delicious medications, all kind of speaking to the fact that he was not happy with where he was and that he was somewhat lucid of what was going on. In 1987, Hinkley applied to the court, allowing him periodic home visits. So this is only 6 years after the event he petitioned the court. What they had to do was show that he was in control with his medications and he was being compliant with his treatment. And therefore, since he's not guilty of a crime, they can't keep him there because they feel like he did something wrong. They're only keeping him there because he's unsafe for the public. They started allowing him supervised visitation with his parents in 1999. So it took 13 years for this to get approved. It only took a year. In 2000, he started getting unsupervised visitation with his parents, where he got to go out. He was allowed supervised visit with his parents again in 2004 and 2005 after they requested that they stop the visitations. There's really no indication of why this happened, but for about a 4-year period, the parents did not want to have did not want John in their home. In 2005, another federal judge ruled that Hinkley would be allowed visits in their home in Virginia. So by this time, they'd moved from California to Virginia, which is very close to Washington, D.C. This had certain conditions to it, and it also needed to be signed off by the treating physicians. At least 2 treating physicians needed to say Hinkley was probably not a threat to anybody else because of the medication, because of the therapy that he was undergoing. If we fast forward to today, Hinkley is actually released from St. Elizabeth's Hospital. This happened in 2016. He's no longer considered a threat to himself or others. The pivotal condition of this release is that he had no contact with the Reagans, he had no contact with the Bradys, and he had no contact with Jodie Foster or Jodie Foster's family. He's going to live with his mother, and he will be restricted to a 50-mile radius around Virginia. So even though he is a free man, there are still potential conditions to what he can actually do. He has Internet use that he had is somewhat limited because of the people that he can or cannot communicate with. He also has to do a risk assessment within 18 months of his release, and he could possibly move out of his parents' home, and he actually got that approved in 2018. If you look at Hinkley as one of the very first people the nation really observed the insanity defense being used on, it really worked if all ends well. We don't know what's going to happen with John Hinkley. He could completely go back into being psychotic and unhealthy and a risk to other people. But if he continues to be on his medications and comply with his therapeutic interventions, and we accept that his behavior was because of a mental defect and not because of something that was inherent within him, we can say that this was a successful insanity plea, that he is now maybe not a productive member of society, but he definitely is a healed person in society. He's not cured, but he's healed. So the Hinkley case really gives us a good place to look at the insanity defense, as how it can work and how it possibly can circumvent certain aspects of the law. For PSYCcast, I'm Professor Mitchell.